God, Tim, is it as warm where you are as it is where I am?
It's definitely sunny, which I don't normally say about I think this summer in particular, but it's definitely warm though. Yes, yeah.
We're so British. We've immediately started talking about the weather, just as a way to kind of ease our way to talking about other things. Yeah, so an unusually warm summer's day here in the UK, and so if you see either of us perspiring, that's the reason why, not the conversation topics. So. I'm delighted to have you on, Tim. And many of you will already know Tim from social media, both Instagram and Twitter. We'll have seen Tim's interactions. I recently republished some of Tim's photos from when he was at a Pride event down in London, which were really, really nice. So thank you for that. And yeah, so but about probably a week or two ago, I think you messaged me after hearing some of the other episodes of on Minds Only, and you wanted to take part. So what led to that?
Yes, well, I think for me, mental health has always been, no, not always, but I think certainly in the past several years, it's been something which has always been at the forefront of my mind for various reasons, which I'll obviously go into in a minute. But certainly when I first heard you were doing the podcast, I was very excited by that. So I think mental health is something which is a cliche to say, but everyone always wants to says, "Well, we must talk about it and talk about this, that," and it is important. And I've always kind of like shared my experiences with many acquaintances and things, but I've never kind of like sort of spoken publicly about it.
Mm.
And obviously being a huge, lifelong Bond fan, the two kind of like came together really. Um, but when I first heard about it over your podcast, and once I listened to like a couple of episodes, I think probably after every episode I would listen to, I would think, oh my goodness, I should have talked about that. Or, oh yes, I'd love it. It's like someone's already done it in a sense. And every time I was kind of like trying to delve into what is it that what can I connect between how has James Bond helped my mental health? And so far, I mean, all your previous guests, so I've really enjoyed listening to, and that they all speak so eloquently and so clearly, and so it's so good at giving a new take on things, which I wouldn't normally have necessarily thought to talk about. Um, so, my own sort of, I guess, my main sort of thing with mental health. So, to kind of give a bit of a background, um, I think um, where to start really. And my main thing is I've been sort of like struggling a lot with depression and to an extent anxiety in sort of recent years. And it's one of those things which I was long aware of before that. That like mental health is a
Mm.
big deal. That I've had friends who like uh, been through things where I knew people. I was kind of aware of what it was in a sense, but delicately. But I think it was only sort of more recent years where it's actually been kind of like more. I started to realize actually there are some negative things which I need to address in my life, and which is sort of taking me downward spirals. I mean, if we were to go back to when I first, I think, really acknowledged or realized to myself that I was having bouts of depression, I think even actually going back to funny enough, back to drama school, which was 12 years ago now. No, 13 years. Time flies. So, as you know, I work as an actor as my
Mm.
main sort of profession. And drama school was a fantastic experience. I'm sure it's going to come up in more positive ways later in this podcast, possibly, because there's so much which I gained from it. But I had this period at one point when I kept having these thoughts about I stress the word about here, but thoughts about suicide.
Mm.
Now, I was aware I was not suicidal. That was, but it was more the fact I was having thoughts about it, and that scared me because I was like, it was the most terrifying thing, and I think it was a lot of just like trying to sort of push myself through the day. But I didn't dare tell anyone about any of this. Partly because I think the conversation about mental health wasn't quite so
Mm.
open. Also, there was a big. I was also kind of scared that I'd be taken out of drama school if I did. If someone did say, "Oh, Tim, you're actually no, we think you're suicidal, so we're going to take you out." And when you worked so hard to get somewhere, which you're hoping it'll be the stepping stone into sort of what you want to spend your life doing and whatever, and somewhere which is mentally very strenuous. And for someone, I was really worried someone's going to say, yeah, no, it's too much for you, Tim. And then have to somehow kind of explain, no, I'm not that bad, but I need to talk to someone about it. So that's, I think, kind of where I sort of first acknowledged that. Then about how long ago now? 7 years ago, I had a rather nasty breakup, which I don't want to go into too many details, but there was a lot of issues with this particular relationship I was in. And I basically started sort of thinking a lot about self-harm. And it wasn't until I don't know when I started acting on those impulses. So I did start self-harming at some point in quite minor ways, which was never severe, but it did grow and grow a bit. Like, sort of like just make. I want to be as open as possible about all of this. I think it's an important conversation. I would find myself, sort of like scratching and making like surface level cuts in myself and things. This was actually much later on, actually. This kind of way really kind of expanded. But after a couple of months, when I first had those thoughts, maybe in a month even, was when I kind of realized, oh, hang on a minute, this isn't normal, which I think is a funny thing to sort of think about, because obviously it's not normal. But I think often when you're in these sort of like places of your mental health, you just kind of you sort of lose track on a certain reality, I think. And so what suddenly seems normal to you, sort of, oh, of course I'd want to cut myself. I mean, it's a stress relief, as a form of dealing with guilt or anything like that. We kind of realize, actually, no, this is unhealthy. It's not right. Anyway, as the months, years went on, so I kind of went through all the sort of various things. I spoke to doctors, spoke to like CBT, yes. I do mean CBT, right? That's
cognitive behavioral therapy. Yeah, I've done
that's
that.
the one. Yeah. No, I was thinking of CBT or CD or the sort of like cannabis supplements, but no, that's no, that happens.
Yeah, CBD is that's
the one.
Yes. Derivative for anxiety. Yeah. Legal kind of treatment for that. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, which is something I fully support, but I didn't want to suddenly kind of like, sort of be, oh no, that's what I know, different thing entirely. So I did all that. I went on medication, partly because I realized that was something which I knew would just take the edge off, to actually help me get through things, to actually do the work to improve myself. Since then, I'm still on medication. I have no issues with it at all. Like, some people kind of talk about it, sort of stigma around it, and I kind of think it's no different to, like, sort of taking, well, for me at least, like taking any other form of medication, even like stuff like paracetamol or whatever. It's just something which there's no negative side effects. I just feel it's
I totally agree. I mean, a couple of people have talked about this on previous episodes a little bit. We've not gone into it in too much detail, but medication, as far as I'm aware, I've taken them a couple of times. It's not been something I've pursued as actively as other forms of coping, but if you've got a chemical imbalance in your brain, then why not take a tablet if it can correct that, if it's serotonin or whatever the form of medication is. That's definitely a stigma that we need to, another stigma underneath the mental health umbrella we need to break down, I think.
Yes, I think a lot of it, I find, in going back, even like watching like various like TV shows, like and such, where if ever there was a subplot about like medication or depression, it would normally people like being too depressed to take their medication, or which I think is dangerous, because it kind of presents medication as being like a stable thing. Like, if only you took your medication, you wouldn't have depression, you'd be fine. Which is like, well, no, that's not how it works. Also, I think most people I know who are on medication love it. Basically, it's one that, well, in the sense that it's like, yeah, this is a lifesaver for me. I don't think in reality people are.
No.
majority of people are necessarily afraid of that kind of stuff. So yeah, no, I would advocate it in timing. I've been very lucky because, like, you know, the first time I went on medication, I wouldn't say like completely changed things around for me, but it helped. I think for a lot of people, it can actually be a little bit of trial and error, sort of finding something, you know, obviously talking with your doctor and seeing what works, what doesn't, and getting that point. And obviously, you know, if there is anything, I'd say I'm not a doctor, I'm not an expert in any of these fields, but you know, it's an important conversation, I think, you know, to be had. I don't just mean here, but I mean like with the person and their doctor or professionals.
Just to pick up upon something you said about self-harming, again, we've touched on this in a couple of episodes, and there's so many different forms of self-harm, obviously. And as you know, I work with young people, and a lot of young people do self-harm as well. And you know, there's no age limit on it at either end, really. From my understanding of it is that a lot of the time we self-harm because it's our way of trying to regain some form of control. It's the only thing that we can control. And you said that this was particularly off the back of a really bad breakup, and you mentioned guilt and all of those things that you can't essentially do anything about because they're already in the past. But you know, sometimes it's difficult to move on, isn't it? So in the present, we make things more bearable by doing things like that. And there's all sorts of forms of self-harm. So I always think James Bond is a self-harmer in lots of ways. He puts himself into dangerous situations, and you know, he drinks an awful lot, and he does, you know, pretty, especially in the books, smokes a lot as well. Those are degrees of self-destruction. So they're his way. I always think of those as forms of self-harm as well.
I would totally agree with that. I think with Bond, there is a kind of element of I'd argue there's even an element of a death wish with him in this sense.
Definitely.
I think that comes through more in Fleming. I think one of the things I've quite liked as sort of rereading some of Fleming's work is actually how invested Fleming is in Bond's mental health. I think the best example, I know Kim Sherwood brought it up in Double or Nothing. She might have done it. I haven't read her new one yet, so I don't know if it comes up.
Oh, you're in for a treat.
The notion of the hurricane room, which I think brings up from Rush with Love, and just like being able to, in a sense, like mentally close himself away in a not particularly precarious situation. I believe he's flying to Turkey and you know, goes in turbulence, and he sort of like internalizes all these different things, sort of meditation. And
James Bond is nearly always a nervous flyer in Fleming. It's definitely one of his triggers. So
yes.
For those who I've actually written a whole article about the hurricane room, but I've never actually published it. So this might be, our chat might be the kind of impetus to actually finally press publish on that. I've been never quite happy with it, but the hurricane room, it appears in From Russia with Love, and then appears again in Double or Nothing. And there's another reference in one of the other novels as well. But the idea that Bond retreats into a safe space. I actually talked with a psychologist about this, who's been on a previous episode, who's written a book about mental health. And I said to him, does this is what Fleming is describing here essentially a technique that a lot of people use within CBT, which we mentioned? CBT didn't exist when Fleming wrote From Russia with Love. But, you know, essentially Fleming did give Bond, he describes the coping strategies that Bond uses to deal with his anxious feelings. So it's a really fascinating passage. And then, as you've already pointed out, in Double or Nothing, Bond has taught that to another of the 00 agents who's been something of his protege. So you're absolutely right. People really overlook how much Fleming was invested in dealing with Bond's mental health. I'm so glad you pointed that out.
I think Fleming in general, I think there's obviously a lot of controversy over like certain views which are expressed, whether it's by him through Bond or other characters. But I think there is a great progressiveness, I think, in other areas as well, which is something I think I've become to appreciate a lot more. And obviously, being a series of novels, Fleming is able to delve a lot more into Bond's own psychology. I feel big chunk of the novels tends to be Bond reminiscing on something quite often, or sort of like, you know, we're just sitting there with his thoughts, even if he's, you know, sort of like, you know, being beaten up or whatever, he'll still be kind of like, you know, looking at that kind of sense of like mental control. I mean, the obvious example, I guess, would be the torture scene in Casino Royale, where he does kind of like, you know, he goes through the effects of torture and like the immediate and also, you know, dealing with the aftermath and things. I think so. I think in some ways, in terms of like mental health, there's a lot more to be gained, I think, from reading Fleming than watching the films. And the films, I think, have been very good. You brought up James Bond being a self-harmer, and I think for me, one particular film which I think, and again, it's perhaps the obvious one to pick up on, that's perhaps obvious, when Skyfall, where obviously we do see him after the pre-credit sequence, you know, relying on drugs, drink, scorpion death games, and all this kind of stuff. But ultimately, I think I love Skyfall for so many different reasons, and obviously we kind of like see him go through, you know, all that he does, and he comes out at the end, the hero, which is, you know, I always feel is how we always want to see Bond.
A lot of mental health difficulties, challenges actually begin quite early in life. So was Bond, how does mental health and Bond intersect in that period of your life, if at all?
Well, funny enough, I mean, this is something which I was thinking about. It's actually a question which I think you posed back in October. I think it's the only time we've met in person at the Casino Royale 70 event at the Pinewood Studios, which was such a fantastic event. And I remember, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you were sort of interviewing, you know, the various writers and guests that we had, and you asked them, like, I think it was like, what was it which got them into Bond, or what was it what Bond meant to them, or
yeah, what do you love? Why do we love James Bond in its purest form? Yeah,
yeah. It's such a simple question, but then actually, I remember even when I was there, so like, you know, thinking, like, yeah, why do I love James Bond? You know,
scary question for some people.
it is. I think because it is such a broad and simple question, I think quite often, like, it's very specific questions, it's easier to get down to a certain point. But the more I thought about it, I thought, being such a shy kid when I was growing up, James Bond, in a sense, it was this alternative world which I could delve into. It was a fancy. I think with all sort of film franchises, book series, and everything, that they do create their own universe. Obviously, science fiction and fantasy works, it's a very obvious, you know, world they create. Sometimes sort of hybrid, sort of, you know, set, you know, Harry Potter, for example, which again I was very into, and probably for the similar reasons. Bond is very much set sort of in the real world, but it is that heightened reality. And I think that's, for me, that's something which I love in so many of the films I watch. I'm a huge film buff in general. And James Bond just happens to be the series which is at the top, and the one which ultimately, I guess, got me into film. And I think it was always something which I think with James Bond and growing up, it was always something I could escape to. I could always go back and put on a film. I could always go back. I could, again, I was sort of saying earlier about like bringing Bond into our everyday lives in certain ways. And one of the things I love, I'm a big film location buff. And especially, like, I remember, in my mind, I thought that was always something which is like, oh, surely anyone, this is fascinating to everyone. You realize actually, no, not everyone is that bus. I remember I used to cycle into my sixth form college. I'd go past the hotel which Michael Caine visits in The Italian Job, and to me that was a conversation starter as far as I was concerned. But no, we suddenly realized that, actually, no, Tim, people aren't that interested that you cycle past a hotel scene in.
I would have been interested, Tim. I'm a location hunter, as you well know.
That you're going to say, it's one of those things you sort of think someone will be interested. But that, for me, I think, again, is part of the fantasy of visiting places, seeing places, and again, like having that association. I think associations, I would say, is the main thing. I
Yeah.
sort of which Bond would help me here. I remember there were times if I'd had like if I was feeling a bit down or whatever, I could put on a Bond. I would know that would sort me out mentally. But I think growing up, obviously the films change, and I think we as people change. And the film, which I think I can't stress enough how important this film was. I don't think there's ever been a film which has been as important to me as this, but the 2006 Casino Royale.
Mm-hmm.
I stress 2006. I do have an appreciation for the 60 so on. So
Same here. Same here.
That'd be a whole other discussion. But I was 17 when Casino Royale came out. I was in the lead up to it. I was one of those people who was really disappointed when I heard Daniel Craig was playing Bond. For me, he was not my. At least at the initial point, I was like, that's not Bond. The more things kind of the news got out about things, you see clips and trailers, and all think, oh, actually, you know what? Maybe they're onto something here. I don't know. And I followed all the behind the scenes stuff as much. And when the film came out, I actually stood amongst the fans at the premiere at Leicester Square, because that wasn't too far from where I was studying. And then the next day, which was a day before its general release, I got to see the film at Leicester Square with a packed audience. And that film could not have been, it was like that film been made for me, in a sense. It was much more down to earth. It felt much more like it was the real world, the world I knew. This loner character who was able to fight through his problems, who was resilient, who would endure pain, suffering, heartbreak, and still come through at the end. And that it was such an important film for me at that time. I think the Craig film was saying, earlier in conversation about Skyfall, it did just grow and grow. This kind of relatable hero. The only one say which doesn't, I'd say, would be No Time to Die, specifically the last 15 minutes for many obvious reasons. But I think that was actually one which I don't want to go into too much detail, but I think for me that was one which I guess the only time where Bond has negatively affected my mental health, because there was that feeling of like, well, if Bond can allow himself to get killed, surely I could. It suddenly getting yourself killed is the Bond thing almost, and it's like spoilers to the very few people who haven't seen.
I think anyone listening or watching to this, Tim, it will already have seen No Time to Die, funnily enough. It's interesting you say that, because I haven't talked about this much on any other episode of any of my podcasts or YouTube videos, and it's not even really in the 13,000 word queer review of No Time to Die. But a lot of people's reactions to No Time to Die, there's lots of different reasons why people have a negative reaction. Some people don't like him being a family man, for instance. I have no issue with that whatsoever. It's one of the things that actually make me love that film. Yeah. And I do really like the end of No Time to Die. I feel like it is earned, but I know so many people are so violently opposed to it. And I think part of it is because it destroys the fantasy that you can always fight through and win. And I can totally understand that. I was in a stronger place mentally myself when I saw that film. But had it been, say, even 10 years before, maybe 15, perhaps 15, if I'd seen that film 15 years before, I think it would have had a significant impact on my mental health. So I don't think you're alone in that. I know other people haven't talked about this, but if that's the whole reason why this is called On Our Minds Only, if that is something in a future episode of this, someone comes on and maybe they've had a similar reaction and maybe they've reflected, maybe it was because of what they were going through in their own lives.
I think it's something which, I think one of the things, there's actually so much I love about No Time to Die, which I think actually annoys me even more. Because I think it's a brilliant film, and I think it's is actually also a really good look at, you know, even like sort of like being suicidal and such, like like the Bond character. The great scene in the DB5 is being shot up all around, and you just get that feeling that like
He's about
he's
to give up.
content with just sitting there and waiting for a bullet to finally break through the glass.
I find that scene so emotional. I did write about that in my career review of it. I find that scene, that for me is the emotional crux of the film. In that moment, he chooses to live, and it's hanging by a thread, and that sets up the ending for me.
Yeah, I think it is such a powerful moment, and there are elements of that throughout the film. I do love the fact that he has a daughter. I love I love the even like most of the stuff on the island I really enjoy. But I think what gets me about one of the things that gets me about the ending is that I have seen him go through so much physically and emotionally, and he's had his life torn apart throughout most of this film. And I think it's one film where I really, really want to see him come through. And you can argue that he does in a certain way. I love that. I mean, I know so many people that really like the ending, and you know, I genuinely love that for them. Like, I don't. If everyone hated it, then I'd kind of think, okay, well, they really messed up. But the fact that it does and does have appreciation from a lot of fans and non-fans as well does make me think that they, you know, whatever they've done, they've made this decision. Whilst I personally don't like it, there's a lot to be said for it being the right decision. The main thing I kind of want to talk about is really actually just the importance of those like fictional heroes. And I specify fictional because they can be, there are far less limitations. Obviously, I think there are so many real life role models in our lives, and always great to like think about. But I think we often shrug off, like if I would say James Bond is a role model, well, he isn't. I don't go around, you know, killing people or
That's a relief.
So yeah, which is so thankfully that didn't but then there are always elements which you do find. I think this is in so much of what we get, I guess, art wise and storytelling. And there was an interesting thing actually. I was once at some kind of like mental health session thing, again, helping people like depression and such. And it was being led by someone who had also, you know, in the past, there's some serious mental health problems, but you know, since come through and was now, you know, sort of sharing experience, like, you know, helping other people. Always wonderful that. And he was saying that at the time he was in university, he had that pair of Homer Simpson socks, which had, I can't remember which episode it's in. I'm a huge fan of The Simpsons, where Homer says, you tried and you failed. The lesson is never try. And he said he would always, again, those, he would take that literally. And so, you know, they were saying, well, I'm not going to bother trying and things. But as he kind of like start things like turn around for him, he kind of realized, well, actually, this is actually one of Homer's strengths as a character, in that he is someone who, yeah, he does fail an awful lot. I mean, he does try also, but as a result of the trying, he has had a ton of incredible experiences throughout his life. There's one episode where he lists off all the jobs he's done, you know, so being an astronaut, a monorail driver, visiting all these places, and like, and it's, I think that kind of got me thinking as well, actually, that there is always something relatable, something admirable, I think, and this is why these stories are so, why they stick, why they're so important. And I think even as I grow up, if I rewatch a film I once enjoyed or still enjoy, I'll always find something new in it. And it might be just like me as an adult, I'll see things from a different perspective. And I think it really is just like, you know, the power of storytelling, as I say, in the sense as a result of our emotional vulnerability, I suppose, not a sort of thing which men typically, or at least not a few decades ago, would, I think, acknowledge.
Do you think the Daniel Craig era helped with that? You said that Casino Royale had quite a, is it overstating the case, say life-changing effect on you? It wasn't for me. It genuinely had a life-changing effect on me, that film. And I've written quite a bit about this. So yeah, do you see that Craig era as being instrumental in that for you?
Oh, definitely. I think. I think it was because I was. It was very much me becoming an adult at that point.
Yeah.
And again, there's lots of things about Bond and Craig's Bond, which is wouldn't necessarily be a good role model, but I think it. But there was a groundedness to those films.
Psychologically.
Hmm.
Even if the adventures are, you know, really ostentatious and everything, and the lifestyle elements, I think there is a psychological reality to those films.
Yes, and I think, as I say, with I think with Casino Royale, things just felt a little bit more within my reach. I mean, I would say it might maybe have some negative. I possibly made myself even more isolated. Suddenly, actually, you know what, to be your own. I mean, no, I will say this: it did encourage me to be my own self. I think. Because this was someone who was very self-assured in spite of all his flaws. Pierce Brosnan's my favorite James Bond, possibly because he was one I grew up with, or possibly just because I genuinely admire him um, and the films which he's done as well as Bond. But I think seeing with Craig's Bond being in many ways sort of very opposite and just being that little bit more grounded, that little bit more introspective, I think it kind of, there were elements of that which I just wanted to be able to, or felt I could tap into. I wanted to be Pierce Brosnan, I wanted to be Roger Moore and all that. But in reality, you know, Dalton and Craig's Bonds were far more, a bit more relatable, I think. I think Dalton always had been for me, anyway. I think that, yeah, I think his kind of like sense of self, sense of objective, I felt, which always kind of came through, I felt with Dalton's Bond always sort of like resonated with me a lot more.
Yeah, totally agree.
Um,
They're the fantasy ones, aren't they? The people who are suave and what's the lyric from Kiss Kiss Bang Bang? Cut through life like every day's the last. They have that confidence. Brosnan
yeah,
and Moore and Connery to an extent as well. But you're right, Dalton and Craig are far more indecisive sometimes, kind of less sure of themselves, and I think that allows certainly, you know, I could say I could project myself more easily onto them. I
yeah,
kind of wish, in a sense, I could project myself easily onto the other ones,
oh,
you
yeah,
know.
yeah,
But
yeah.
in reality, I'm, you know, if I was going to project myself onto anyone, it would probably be Daniel Craig's Bond, and then probably second Dalton's. Yeah,
It's the whole thing is a fantasy, um, as I know I've said so many times. But then at the same time, it's something to aspire to. I feel. I think I've always liked that about one of the things I always like is like a good example of this. I think is in Man with the Golden Gun when you know M asks, well, you know, what do you know about a man called Scaramanga? And you know Roger, it's oh yes, and then goes this
reels all of
long
that off. Yeah,
ramble of like yeah, as if this is just kind of, this is part of this. It's like oh yeah, no, I've got all these facts just like in the back of my head. And it's a small detail about the Bond's character, but I do love the fact that he just is very knowledgeable on all these things. And again, that's kind of one of those. It's a more relatable association. I want to. I want to be able to know all these things. Obviously, not all these things, but that kind of interest. And I think the way Bond dresses, I think, as well, has in many ways influenced my style choice. I'm literally wearing a navy blue polo shirt. It seems very Connery or grey.
I was going to say, you look very. I almost, you know, it's really weird, Tim. I almost put my not an expensive one, somewhere probably the Boohoo version or whatever. But I almost put my Thunderball blue shirt on today because it's really cool and it's so flipping warm today. But I decided not to. Otherwise, we would totally be clashing today.
Yes. I mean, it's the perfect weather for a day like today. But again, it's just. I mean, I'm going to feel like I'm repeating myself an awful lot here, but
I think it's probably, I mean, I almost want to give you a virtual hug, like that, in a sense, because clearly a lot of this stuff is still quite recent for you. And I'm still processing stuff from like 30 years ago. And particularly all the stuff around coming out in my early 20s. I'm still mid-20s. I'm still, I'm in probably the strongest place I've ever been mentally in my entire life. But that doesn't mean that I've got it all cracked and all sorted. And I've, been in pains to point out, and my guests in previous episodes have been in pains to point out, this is always going to be a journey, and it's a lifelong journey, and you develop coping strategies. So, I don't want to kind of wrap things up with a neat bow or anything like that, but how are you feeling right now?
Well, funnily enough, before I came on, when I came on, I thought this is going to be a really positive talk about mental health and all the great things about Bond and how that has shaped me, and which I guess I hope it has. I hope it's been helpful to other people. But I remember, like, before. One of the reasons that, because I spent a lot of time like brainstorming, like, what would I want to talk about with David, and it got to the point before I just need to go and talk, because the more I delve back into this, the more I'm just gonna feel like I don't want to fully revisit stuff. No. I don't feel like it's at all what I'm doing. To be honest, I am so pleased that I can talk about this. I think. And it is nice. I think I've gone into far more personal things than I thought I would. I have no idea how this is going to go. And again, I'm rambling here, but it's been able to good to actually be able to get all this out like somewhere a bit more public, rather than like just talking, between me and an associate, a friend, or whoever. As to where I am mentally now, I would say like generally things are a lot better. As with everyone, there are ups and downs in my life. There's always new problems to solve. I do love that Dalton quote.
I'm an eliminator.
Yeah, I know anyone listening to this podcast almost will know exactly what I'm talking about there. It's kind of like which again I think is such a fun thing amongst Bond fans. Again, going back slightly to what I was saying about his harmless hobbies, like. Amongst Bond, you can make the tiniest, reference to a quote in one of the 25 or 27 films, depending on how you look at it, and people know what you're talking about. There is a beauty in that. I'm not really quite sure exactly how to. One can't really say how one is mentally, but generally. I would say generally things are on the up, have ups and downs, but at this point, I feel I've lived with a lot of this for sufficiently long, and can talk openly about it. But when things get bad, I know how to cope with it. I think that's kind of, again, it's a things I haven't said, like grief, guilt, depression, all these things. We don't necessarily cure them. We just find better and better ways to deal with it. So I think in that sense, it is a journey. And again, taking things back to Fleming, I always feel whenever I'm reading his works, or indeed many of the continuation writers as well, it is going on a journey. It's taking me somewhere, it's progressing, and I'm sitting with this character as they go through whatever they're going through physically, mentally, and we always just see what the destination is.